My name is Catlin Tucker, and this session is focused on instructional delivery across learning environments. So really thinking about what instructional delivery can look like in a physical classroom, online, or kind of a blend of the two. The strategies, all of them that we're going to go over today, are really designed to be kind of fluid in the sense that they can work in any teaching and learning landscape, which is always kind of my goal. My apologies, as I shared in the chat window. My low this week is still recovering from COVID. So those of you who were with me last week, you knew I was kind of dealing with my first round of COVID. Not a pleasant experience. It's still definitely impacting my voice and my energy levels, but very excited to be with you all today. And just keep in mind as we get into the session, if you have any questions after or between any of our sessions, since obviously I'm offering a series of these, I am very easy to hunt down online. So you can send me a tweet, you can send me a note on Instagram, you can find me on my website. If there's anything you're curious about, I know sometimes the webinar format can be a little limiting in terms of our interaction, but you guys have access to the chat window, so don't be shy. I would love to have you engage as much as you're willing during these sessions. I think that's what makes them really rewarding, is when we feel like we can engage in conversation and ask questions. So I start every professional learning kind of experience with a check-in. And part of the reason I start with a check-in or an icebreaker or some kind of welcome activity is I'm really trying to model what I would love for educators to be doing with students, which is, instead of diving headlong into curriculum, really starting with some of these kind of informal conversations that allow students to get to know each other, build relationships, maybe a way to kind of cultivate some of that social emotional learning with self-awareness. And so the welcome activity today, and some of you have already kind of shared where you're coming from in New York, what you teach, where you teach, maybe what you want to learn today. But I also have this kind of check-in question, and I love this one to use with teachers, to use with leaders or students, which is just kind of a high-low check-in. So thinking about the last week or the last 7 days, kind of what's been something that's been a high, and it could be professional, it could be personal, whatever you're comfortable sharing. So I shared that I just found out I'm going to get to work with educators in Thailand this year, which is really exciting because that's not an international destination that I've been to for the purpose of work before. And it's always exciting to get to travel and work with new people and different countries. So that was really exciting. And then Milo, the thing that has been challenging or frustrating or that I'm struggling with, is definitely COVID. I think I was hoping that being vaccinated and boosted and super healthy would mitigate some of what I'm experiencing. And I'm sure it did, but I still feel pretty crappy. So I'm about a week and a day out and still low energy. So that would be my low. So if you haven't shared your high, your low for the last week or so, and you feel inclined, I would love to have you throw that into the chat window, just so we can get a sense of who's on the call, what's been going well for them, and what's been kind of a challenge, or what have y'all been struggling with. So feel free to throw those in if that sounds like something you would like to do. So once we kind of begin with a welcome activity, whether it's to kick off class or to kick off small group work or small group discussions, I think this just gives students that opportunity to form relationships and feel a little bit more comfortable taking those academic risks that we're always asking them to do. So let me move forward. Last week, for those of you who were with me last week, we focused on kind of designing, kind of planning, learning. We use this like backward design approach to thinking through mini units of study. And one of the resources I shared was this curriculum mapping document. And so if you were with me last week, you don't have to have been with me for the session. I just wanted to contextualize kind of what we're doing if you were with me. But if you were with me last week, then we were kind of backward designing from learning objectives to assessment, and then thinking through the instructional path. And really the focus of today's session is around this column that says instruction, really thinking about what are students going to need to hear or see from us during a particular lesson or unit of study in order to make progress toward firm, standard aligned goals. And so there are obviously a couple of different ways to approach instruction, but one of the things I think is really valuable before we dive into these strategies is to take a minute to think about, for a lot of teachers, they're still relying very heavily or exclusively on kind of the whole group teacher-led model. And when it comes to instruction, that's the teacher at the front of the room, kind of providing instruction, explanations, models in the form of lectures, mini lessons for the entire class. And so before we start to explore other approaches to instruction, I think it's worth kind of examining, why do we think so many teachers use this particular approach exclusively, or at least kind of predominantly, right? So the first question I'm going to have you consider is, what do you think are the benefits of the whole group teacher-led model, from a teacher perspective? Obviously, if a lot of teachers use this model, there's a reason why. And I think it's helpful to kind of surface why that might be. And then, so from that teacher experience, what do we think are the benefits of this model? And what are some of the challenges of this model? And we're going to use a Jamboard so you guys can kind of share your thinking with the rest of us and kind of collaborate in a shared digital space. And once you've had a chance to think about, okay, what are the benefits? What are some of the challenges of that teacher-led whole group approach? Then we're going to shift gears and we're going to put ourselves in the seat of a student in a whole group teacher-led lesson and do the exact same thing. From a student's perspective, what are the benefits of being a student in a teacher-led whole group model? And what are some of the kind of downsides or the challenges from a student perspective? So what I have done, I'm going to throw this into the chat window for you all, is I have put together a Jamboard. So when you click on that link in the chat window, it'll take you to this Jamboard where you can either pull over a Post-it note, or you can, create a text box if you want to kind of identify, hey, from my perspective as a teacher, I think these are the benefits of a whole group teacher-led model. And I think these are some of the challenges associated with this model. And then you'll see up at the top, just in case anybody hasn't used Jamboard before, you're going to see this little icon with a 1-2. That just means there's 2 slides and we're looking at 1 of 2. The second slide is around that student experience. So I want everybody to start in the teacher experience, brainstorm your thinking. Do not worry, there's no right or wrong here. I'm just curious. And then click over and do the same thing with students. So I'm going to set the timer for like 5 minutes on my end. I'll give you a 2-minute warning and just let you guys think about this, brainstorm, capture your thinking on the Jamboard. And I'll mute myself so there's no distracting background noise. All right, so once you've had a chance to kind of share your thinking here on the teacher side, you can go ahead and toggle over to slide 2. We're about 2 minutes or so left, and start thinking about, from a student perspective, what could you imagine being the benefits from their perspective of being a student in a whole group teacher-led model versus what might be challenging about that experience from a student perspective. We've got about 30 seconds left. All right, so let's take a look at what you guys have kind of collected on this Jamboard slide about the teacher experience. So can drive instruction and lead thinking in a specific manner, right? Guiding thinking, kind of navigating the conversation. Challenges is that it can be very hard to keep students engaged. It's challenging or difficult to modify or differentiate. Students might, they are getting exposed to key concepts and new information. There's also somewhere on here where it's like students can be confident they're getting the right information, right? Sometimes when we allow students to discover as opposed to listen to us explain something, then, it might be more challenging to be confident, like, did I find the right information? Am I making sense? Again, another kind of similar concept about, clarification, avoiding misconceptions. A downside is not all students get to participate or have a voice. A benefit is the ability to model expectations. Challenges, students begin to zone out because they're not being actively engaged in thinking, a lot of passive listening and watching. And then teacher-led gives students clear defined curriculum. So a lot of obvious benefits, some definite challenges, right? Challenges around engagement, challenges around differentiation. What I don't see in here is often teachers will also point out, like, it's hard to pace it perfectly for everybody, right? We know we're going a little too fast for some kids, a little too slow for others, which can be challenging and can often lead to kids kind of, again, zoning out or feeling bored. The student experience, we have a challenge being students may not want to ask questions in front of the big group. That's a great one. I often will have teachers point out that students can hide in this kind of an environment, right? They don't have to be put on the spot. This says students with special needs or students who speak languages other than English might have a hard time following the information or a discussion. Some kids learn through doing. They need that kinesthetic kind of tactile experience. As a student, I would be thinking that I'm hearing the correct version of information on a topic. Again, we have another note that says they don't all get a voice in this type of lesson. The benefit is the teacher may not call on me. Absolutely, I can hide. A challenge is may not understand what's being taught. Benefit, some students might need a little more guidance or demonstration about how to tackle a question or problem. Challenge, there might be less peer-to-peer collaboration, or students don't have those opportunities necessarily to work together if the teacher is spending a lot of time at the front of the room talking and transferring information. So great. Obviously, some great ideas being shared here. Before we get too much further into this, I did want to make sure you guys had access to our resource document. So those of you who were with me last session, this is something I like to do. These sessions go by really quickly, and I want to make sure that you have resources that will be helpful in digging into some of these ideas and kind of playing with them after this session today. So we're really going to approach instruction today, since so many teachers use the whole group teacher-led model. And I think what we found during the pandemic is that model didn't work as well online, right? Without that physical proximity, we couldn't control whether students turned on their videos, whether they engaged in online lessons. And so we're going to really focus on leveraging video instruction, when that's best used, how to go about creating it, and then also talking about how do we make time for small, differentiated group instruction? Because as you guys pointed out, it's hard to kind of meet students where they're at in terms of their specific needs, skill levels when it's a whole group instructional session. We might have special education students who are mainstreamed. We might have students who their primary language is not English. We might just have students who their skill set is a little behind the rest of the class or a little ahead of the rest of the class. And so how are we making sure we're meeting that diversity of need in the way that we are designing our and facilitating our lessons with students? And so when it comes to instruction, often when I'm working with educators in a training or a coaching capacity, I will ask them a very simple question, and that will help us decide, do we make a video or do we pull instruction into a small group differentiated session? And the question is this: are you going to say the same thing the same way for everybody? Because if you're going to say the same thing the same way for everybody, it's probably best to make a video, because those foundational explanations are also often the ones we repeat over and over and over again over the course of a school year. And we lose a lot of instructional minutes to that repeat instruction. Now, anything that is a little bit more nuanced, it would really benefit from us kind of working with smaller groups where we might pull problems and prompts at different levels or use texts at different levels of rigor and complexity. Those are the kinds of instruction that we want to pull into differentiated small groups. So I'll give you a concrete example from my subject area, which is English. So as an English teacher, if I was going to explain to students how to write a thesis statement, like what is a thesis statement, where does it go in your essay, and how do you write one, I kind of say the same thing the same way for everybody. So that would make a really good video. And as an English teacher, I end up repeating that over and over again all year long, like until I want to rip my hair out. So when I make a video, yes, there is a little time investment making that video, but man, does it pay off in dividends over the course of the year. Then if I'm trying to teach something like analyzing quotes, which is a more challenging skill, definitely more nuanced, I'm going to break students up into groups based on some kind of formative assessment data. I'm probably going to pull quotes at different levels of academic rigor and complexity. And then I'm going to have different kinds of scaffolds and supports, maybe things like sentence stems to get students started who need additional support available for different groups. So I have the luxury of making sure that that instruction is really targeting where the learner is at in terms of their specific needs and skills. So that's how I would make that decision as an educator. Am I going to say the same thing, same way for everybody? Okay, I'm going to make a video. If it's a more nuanced, more kind of a challenging skill or instructional session that would really benefit from differentiation, then I'm pulling it into small group. And so we're going to talk about how we do and make time for both of those. So video instruction is often daunting for teachers. I think a lot of teachers kind of bit the bullet and they did it during COVID. And so they're a little more comfortable, but it definitely takes some time. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the barriers that can often exist that make it hard for students to access and understand information when it's presented live. So I'm going to throw into the chat window for you guys a link to a Mentimeter. Hold on, let me see if I can get my little window out of the way. Here we go. Where you guys can kind of think about some of those barriers and throw your ideas into what will essentially be a real-time word cloud. So if you think about live instruction, whether it's a mini lesson or a lecture, what are some of those barriers that might exist that would make it hard for your students to access that information, to understand it, to take it in? So I'll give you guys about a minute. Again, this link is in the chat window. To click on that link and you'll see like 3 little text boxes. So you can put up to 3 words or phrases that you think do a good job of kind of like articulating some of these barriers that exist when we use live, real-time, whole group instruction. So I'll pause myself. I'll watch the chat window. You guys have the link to Mentimeter. So hopefully you can throw your ideas into the mix. Perfect. All right, I'll mute myself so I'm not creating any background noise. All right, so feel free to keep throwing your words into the mix. You can kind of see it updates in real time, and the bigger the words, the larger the words in the cloud means the more people have input that word. So our biggest word is definitely around language and vocabulary. Definitely for our second language learners, the language and vocabulary can be a huge barrier to accessing new information. But even for our English speakers, sometimes they don't have the academic language, the subject-specific language and vocabulary to access information. We have things like learning styles, learning disabilities, inability to focus, insufficient background knowledge, fear, inability or unwillingness to ask questions, all kinds of issues that can get in the way of students really taking in new information. And despite all those barriers, most teachers are still, like I said, relying on that kind of whole group teacher-led live instruction to transfer information. But as you guys have pointed out, a lot of these barriers might make it challenging for students to be successful in that moment, kind of acquiring new information. So it can be everything from hearing impairments to, as you guys pointed out, attention deficit and issues and challenges, even memory and kind of processing challenges, insufficient background knowledge, which you guys kind of pointed out. The pacing of the presentation might be too fast or too slow. On my feedback form, every semester, I would ask students to share their thoughts on the class with me. And I almost always had often second language learners just say, I like your class, you talk too fast. And they can't really control the pace at which I present information or talk. And that can present a barrier. Obviously, vocabulary can be hugely challenging as well. Now, the benefits of video are vast. One, it does position the student to be in complete control over the pace at which they move through this new information. They can pause the video, they can rewind it, they can watch it half a dozen times if they need to. We also create these resources that not just our students, but also their families can access beyond the classroom if they're trying to support their learners in the home environment. It is very freeing, I have to tell you, not to have to repeat ourselves over and over again. And so when you're thinking about making video, maybe that's the place to start, is like, what is it that I tend to say over and over again that I could couch in a video to avoid losing those instructional minutes and to avoid those feelings of frustration, having to go back over the same content. If you have any movement in and out of your classes mid-year, it's also really nice to know, like, hey, here's a playlist on this particular topic or subject. You can self-pace through it. You have access to the instruction, some of the foundational instruction that you missed before joining this class. And even using video in the classroom can really kind of function to replicate the teacher and allow the teacher to move more fluidly around the room as students self-pace through some of these explanations. So if we're going to be talking about using video for instruction, we also want to be thinking about how do we create effective video content, right? So we're creating videos that are going to be as effective and impactful as possible. So based on the research, here's what we know for creating effective educational videos. One, we want to keep them short and sweet. And this aligns with something called segmenting and chunking. So we don't want to try to cover too much ground in a video because we don't want our videos to be long. Video length has the biggest impact on student engagement with videos. So it would be better to record a series of short videos as opposed to one really long video. And I can tell you from my own experience, using or kind of really focusing on very specific things in your video makes them more useful long-term. So for example, I remember creating almost 15-minute video on how to write an argumentative paragraph. And then when I was reading my students' argumentative paragraphs, some were really struggling with claims, some were struggling to pull textual evidence, some were struggling with analysis, introducing their quotes, citing properly. And I realized, oh my gosh, I have to record this, and I have to record a bunch of individual videos, because if I'm going to tell students, hey, rewatch this video on claim, I want to give them a short video on claim. I don't want to direct them back to a 15-minute video where that's just going to be a very small part of a larger conversation. So segmenting and chunking just really reminds us to focus on small bits of new information at a time, keeping those videos short and sweet. The second is signaling and cueing, and that's how are we helping students to track the important information on the screen. So if you're building your presentation that you're going to use in your video, say in Google Slides, can you use the animation feature to underline or put boxes around keywords at specific moments in your video, or highlight key details in a visual by marking it with an arrow or a star of some kind to just draw the student's eye to the information you're presenting as you present it. Weeding just means you want to eliminate anything unnecessary, any unnecessary information, visuals, like thematic backgrounds that might appear in your video. And then finally is matching modality. You want what students are seeing, what's going into their pictorial visual channel, to align with what they're hearing, what's going into their auditory verbal channel. And so as you're creating your video, what is it that students are going to see as you're explaining? Because you want those things to be in alignment as much as possible. Now, teachers always ask, like, how long should my videos be? And there was a research study done in 2014 that kind of tracked student engagement with instructional videos, streaming videos. And what they found is there was kind of like this sweet spot around the 6-minute mark. And there was a subtle drop off between 6 and 9 minutes, and then a much more dramatic drop off after 9 minutes. So sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, 6 minutes is ideal for videos. But this particular research study was focused on those massive online open source courses, MOOCs, which are mostly composed of opt-in adult learners. So I think you have to kind of take the research with a little bit of a grain of salt. And in my own work with teachers, I will often kind of use this rule of thumb. And so if I'm working with a 3rd grade teacher, we might be shooting for like a 3 or 4 minute video. If I'm working with a 9th grade teacher, we might be shooting for a 9th or 10 minute video. So for me, 1 minute of video content per year in school has actually been a really wonderful guide for creating videos as I coach teachers from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So video length, you just want to err on the side of short and sweet for sure. So before sharing some examples of what you might kind of think about presenting in video, I'm curious, as you think about that question around, are you going to say it the same way to everybody? What instruction do you tend to repeat? What content, explanations, processes, or models do you tend to present for all students the same way and often have to repeat? So you are welcome to throw, if it's easier to just throw your ideas in the chat window, wonderful. If you want to share them here on Mentimeter, that's great as well. So what are those kind of, what's that content, explanation, process, models that you typically present the same way for all students? And then also kind of keeping an eye on, like, what are those things you find yourself repeating over and over again through the course of the school year? And let's just generate a collection in case people are feeling like they're struggling a little bit to identify, what would I make a video of? What would be helpful to present in this format? So I'll mute myself for the next minute, let you guys share your ideas here, and then we'll move forward. All right, and you guys can keep throwing your ideas here if you'd like. We've got some, demonstrating procedures, teaching grammar, definitely mathematical procedures, like solving for X, finding the lowest common denominator, criteria for how they'll be assessed. I love that. I think going through like a rubric at the beginning of an assignment that's going to be assessed and kind of talking through what's expected is a great use of this. Definitely a shout out to Brain Pop and using some of those videos with learners as well. Wonderful. So again, you guys can keep throwing your ideas in there if you'd like to kind of build on what you guys have already shared. Definitely, whenever we're asking students to apply a particular strategy where they might benefit from seeing that or hearing us conduct a think aloud or seeing us implement that strategy so they can return to that as a support, how to structure a particular part of writing, how to solve a particular type of math problem, identifying different kinds of equations, assessing website credibility and the questions they should be asking when they do online research, analyzing a text, even setting up notes, whether it's Cornell notes or like how to set up a concept map, anything that you feel like would be helpful for students to have a high degree of control over the pacing can be really, really helpful. And if we're going to be providing instruction and models in video format, I always encourage teachers, we want to avoid students slipping into that passive consumptive kind of role that they would inhabit in a classroom during a live lecture or mini lesson. And so how do we build engagement around the video? So it's not just like we're going to use the video to flip the explanation and instruction. We also want to think about how are we encouraging students to think critically about that information. We don't want them to mentally check out just because they're watching a video. So maybe we have them answering questions about the content. Maybe we provide a guided note template or graphic organizer to help them to kind of identify the most important pieces of information and to organize it appropriately. Maybe we allow them to draw something or create sketch notes if we have really visual learners, or even completing a simple kind of 3-2-1 activity. 3 things you learned, 2 questions you have, 1 thing that was unclear, or 3 things you learned, 2 connections you made, 1 question you have. So you can kind of play around with that formatting of a 3-2-1, but it's a nice way to get them checking in, kind of thinking about what did I learn from this video and what connections did I make? What questions do I have? Is there anything that was unclear that I want to know more about? And so plenty of teachers pair videos with just like handwritten questions that students answer as they watch them. You could also use a tool like Edpuzzle to kind of build engagement around the video, where basically you can have Edpuzzle pause at strategic moments in the video, present students with a question that they have to answer, multiple choice or short answer. And those answers can provide some really interesting formative assessment data about what are students understanding from this video? Are they paying attention as they're working through the video? That way, hopefully, and we can see on our end who actually watched the video, which I know is often a big concern with teachers. Is like, if I'm going to rely on video instruction, how do I hold kids accountable? How do I make sure that they actually watch the video? And so the questions are a really wonderful way to do that as well. This is an example of like a 3-2-1, just like a simple format to get them reflecting. And often when I work with teachers, like I was working with a science teacher who really wanted students to take detailed notes as they were watching the video. And so we put together these kind of guided note templates that went with each of her instructional videos. And you'll notice at the end of the guided note template, we also included a 3-2-1 embedded there because she wanted them to pause at the end of the video, at the end of taking notes, and really reflect on those things they learned, what they were curious about, what they didn't understand. So video can be incredibly powerful for freeing educators. And one of the things I really love is the more time and space we have in classrooms to connect with students, the more we can focus on that differentiation. So if we're not making a video, then the other option that I presented was small group differentiated instruction. And often the way teachers will make time for that is with blended learning models. So my area of expertise is obviously blended learning. And when I talk about blended learning, what I am referring to is active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline. That's it. And it can happen entirely in a classroom using something like the station rotation model. It can extend beyond the classroom with video instruction assigned for homework, like the flipped classroom model. Lots of different ways to combine active engaged learning online and offline. But really at its kind of center or at its heart, blended learning is trying to shift control from teacher to learner, giving them more control over their experience. And there are, like I said, lots of different models that combine active engaged learning online and offline. And the different models give students different degrees of control over these 4 elements of their learning: time, place, pace, and path. So they're not going to control all of those things all the time, but the goal is truly to give them more control more of the time. And what these models can really free us to do is to spend less time at the front of the room kind of talking at students and transferring information, and more time working with small groups and individual learners. So when it comes to how do we create the time and space for small differentiated group instruction, one of the models I lean on a lot when I'm working with teachers is the station rotation model. So it does exactly what the name suggests. There are a series of stations in the room and students rotate through them. One of those stations is the teacher-led station. And depending on the data we use to group students, we might focus our energies at the teacher-led station providing needs-based instruction. We realize that different groups in the class actually need instruction on totally different things. And so as they cycle through our teacher-led, we might focus our instruction based on what one particular group needs, and it might be totally different instruction than another group would get. So for example, in high school English, when it comes to grammar, kids are just everywhere. Some students do not know their parts of speech, and some students are ready for sentence combining or passive and active voice. I would never start everybody at parts of speech because 4 or 5 kids don't know their parts of speech. Instead, I'm going to give some diagnostic pre-assessment tests, figure out where are they in relation to some key concepts, grammatical concepts, and then I'm going to group them based on need, and they're all going to get different instruction depending on what group they're in. Another option is to know that you're going to basically spend your teacher-led station digging into a skill or a strategy. But based on the data about your students, that students are in different places with different skills, abilities, language proficiencies. And so you want to differentiate that introduction of new information or new skills for each group of student. You might want to have supports and scaffolds in place for particular students. You might use problems or prompts at different levels of academic rigor and complexity, depending on what you think the students are ready for. So the station rotation model carves out that time for the teacher to work directly with small groups of learners. And then while students are in the other stations that are not teacher-led, the online, the offline stations, really there's this opportunity to give them more control over the pace at which they move through the task. We can encourage collaboration and communication among students, and even think about differentiating those activities at the other stations effectively to better meet students' needs. So the teacher-led station is what we're really going to focus on, because this is going to allow us to offer that differentiated teacher-led instruction. But we can also use this space for things like interactive modeling sessions, guided practice and application, giving students feedback as they're working on a task, whether it's a writing or a performance task or a project of some kind. We can facilitate small group discussions about texts and topics and issues related to our curriculum. And the more we allow students to engage with us at the station, the more they get to practice, apply, discuss, question, the more really valuable formative assessment data we're going to be collecting, and the better sense we're going to have of what students need from us as their teacher. So I want to present 5 different ideas for how you might structure your teacher-led station to provide more differentiated kind of instruction. So the first, and you have a document linked from your resource document that I shared to what you're about to see in case you want to dig in a little deeper after our session today. So the first one is called Hook the Group. And the idea with Hook the Group is instead of starting with instruction, starting with a model, you actually start by presenting your small group with an unfamiliar problem, task, or challenge. So if I'm a math teacher, it's a problem students haven't seen before. If I'm an English teacher, maybe it is asking students to, make inferences about a new text, right? And the goal of this is to get students comfortable approaching tasks that are unfamiliar, because so often when students approach something that's new and unfamiliar, they just kind of throw their hands up in the air and shut down. Like, I don't know how to do this. Well, it's like, wait a second, you're going to approach a lot of things in your life that you don't initially know how to do. So we're trying to kind of build that stamina so that they're comfortable sitting in a space of productive struggle. So as students kind of work through this unfamiliar problem, task, or challenge, usually with a peer support or small group support, we are just listening. We're observing. What are the misconceptions? What are the strong strategies they're using? What questions are they asking? We want to really focus on being that listener, being that observer as they work through this unfamiliar task. Then as they collaborate and discuss, as that comes to an end, then we pull them back together and we debrief. What did they do? Why did they do it? What questions do they have? And then we follow with instruction and modeling. And part of the reason we do this is once they've sat in that space of productive struggle, most students are much more kind of curious about the instruction itself, right? They're like, well, now I'm curious. I want to know the answer because I've tried to work through this with my classmates. The second strategy is one that I know most teachers are super familiar with and use, and I'm gonna encourage a modification. So it's modifying the classic I do, we do, you do, to include a groups do. So instead of simply moving from the we do to the you do, we want to really make sure students are ready for independent practice. So we start with the I do, which is beginning with that explanation and model. We're basically conducting a think aloud so students can see us explain or work through something. Then we shift to the we do. So as a group, we're going to run through another example, and I'm going to ask students to chime in and practice. Then we get into the groups do. This is more of a gradual release where we might strategically pair students or split our group, our smaller teacher-led group in half, and let them try this thing with peer support, no teacher support. So the goal is we're listening, we're observing. Can students do this with peer support? If so, they're probably ready for independent practice. If they're struggling to do this thing with just peer support and no teacher support, then they probably need more time with us. So we can release the students who are ready for independent practice, and we can continue working with learners who need a little bit more instruction, support, or models from us. The third strategy for facilitating these kind of differentiated instructional sessions is using students' work to drive these sessions. So whether it is review and practice they've done in the classroom, review and practice you assigned for homework, pulling them into the teacher-led station, and starting that time by giving them maybe 4 or 5 minutes, work with a partner, work with a couple other students to basically check their assignment. So if it's something that can be graded with an answer key, great. Give them an answer key, encourage them to work through any problems they got wrong, see if they can figure out what they did wrong and how to correct it. And if they can't figure it out, make sure we circle that because that's when we're going to spend time on together in the teacher-led station. If it's something more organic, like a piece of writing, then giving them a really strong exemplar exemplar or example with a very simple rubric and asking them to complete a self-assessment is another great way to get them thinking critically about their work and what it's telling them about their skills. Because I think so often we're the ones who are always thinking critically about student work. We're the ones grading for accuracy, when really, if it's review and practice, this should be a tool that we're using to make sure if they need more instruction, if they need more modeling in a particular area, we're able to kind of direct that reteach or that additional instruction or models to what a specific group of learners might need. So whatever part of the assignment they're struggling with, that's what we want to focus on. The fourth strategy is pulling feedback into these teacher-led station kind of sessions so that we're giving students feedback on something as they work. So basically giving them individualized, actionable comments they can take to improve their piece of work, be it a piece of writing, be it a performance task, or a project of some kind. The last strategy is something I call present, pause, discuss, repeat. So instead of covering large chunks of information, really being thoughtful about chunking the presentation of new information into bite-sized pieces so that we're not talking for more than 3 to 5 minutes at a time. And then as we're presenting that new information, can students be taking notes? Do they need a guided note template? Would a graphic organizer be helpful? And after we present that first chunk, we pause, we give students a minute or two to kind of review their notes, talk to a partner. Is there anything they're confused about? Any questions they have? Anything they want more kind of clarification on or explanation in relation to? And then using those questions to guide a quick conversation about the content to make sure we're all on the same page before the teacher jumps into the next bite-sized piece of information. So I wanted to give you guys kind of an example of each of these just to kind of get you thinking about what this could look like. So online during COVID, I was working with a math teacher who was going to do an instructional session on shape properties. And he was like, it's not the most exciting. I just really want to hook their interest. So let's use that strategy first. So we pulled this puzzle from illustrative mathematics and basically put students in breakout rooms and said, okay, you have 3 minutes to decide how many rectangles are here. You can sketch it out, you can label it, but be ready to share how you arrived at your answer. So we put them all in breakout rooms. They had a set amount of time to kind of work together to try to come up with an answer of how many rectangles they thought were in this puzzle. And then we pulled them back together and we asked them to, first we did like one of those waterfalls where they each put their number in. We did a countdown of 3 and then they released so we could see what number each group had come up with. And then we discussed what strategies did you use, what questions came up. And then he kind of started in on his instructional session on shape properties, incorporating some of the things that came up in the conversation. Like one student was adamant, that's a square, it's not a rectangle. And so he got to pull that kind of into the conversation. And like, well, actually a square is a rectangle. And so it's really about trying to like hook their interests first. The second with that I do, we do, groups do, you do is wonderful for skills, for strategies. So if I'm an English teacher and I want to present, a reading comprehension strategy, like asking and answering questions about a text, I might choose texts at different levels based on the group I'm working with. I'm going to conduct a think aloud and basically make my thinking explicit as I read the text out loud and pause periodically to ask and answer questions about it so students can kind of see this strategy in practice. Then we move into the we do. I'll probably keep reading out loud, pausing and inviting students to jump in with their questions or to answer questions to practice the strategy with teacher support. Then I'm going to pair students off or split the group in half and have them continue practicing this reading comprehension strategy as I watch, like who's got it, who seems like they're still struggling. I'm going to release the students who are ready for independent practice, and I'm going to continue working with the students who need more support from me because they're still kind of honing this particular skill. Assignment check and review, like I said, whether it's grammar or vocabulary or a practice set of math problems, if it's something you can just give students an answer key, have them pair up, work together, try to problem solve if they got stuck on one, fantastic. If it's something more organic, it's still a wonderful way to use the assignments you're providing students to drive some deeper thinking about what are they understanding, what are they frustrated by, where do they need more support from you, the teacher, and then really targeting our instruction, reteach, models, supports, and scaffolds to the specific parts of the assignment they're struggling with. So if it's more organic, then giving them that strong example and a simple rubric can be a wonderful way to encourage that self-check. Fourth is real-time feedback. And again, because we have a limited amount of time with students in a small teacher-led group, we want to be really focused with our feedback, really helping students, nudging them to explore a different strategy, linking them with a video or a resource that might support them, asking questions to drive deeper thinking in these sessions. And then last but not least is that present, pause, discuss, repeat. So as a coach, I was doing a model lesson for a 6th or 7th grade English teacher, and this was online. And so I put together a presentation, a Google slide presentation with the content, and I tried to break it up. So instead of going through the whole thing, I wanted it to be in bite-sized chunks. And after each bite-sized chunk, I had a little slide like this, just reminding myself, okay, pause, let them catch up with their notes because I had given them a guided note template. Make sure if they have any questions, we spend some time exploring and discussing those questions before I jump into the next section of this presentation. So again, it's about really tackling that introduction of new information in bite-sized pieces, even if we are live. So those are 5 different ways to kind of go about structuring your time and designing your time with students in that differentiated teacher-led experience. So I'm just curious, and I know I think I saw some questions pop up. I don't know where it goes when you guys wave that you have a question. So if you can put it in the chat, I'm happy to answer any questions that have popped up for you guys today. There is also that question answer feature, but if you're happy putting in the chat, that works for me. And then let me just throw this Mentimeter link back into the chat window as well. So basically this has those 5 strategies, and I'm just curious for the folks who are on the call today, if there's ones you can see yourself using more than others, like if you're really drawn to hook the group, or you're like, oh, I already use I do, we do, you do, I could definitely imagine kind of playing with a modification with that groups do to make sure that I'm really differentiating the experience based on what students need. So I'll give you guys a chance to kind of rank those in Mentimeter. And then while you're doing that, Teresa, do we get a copy of the slides? I can absolutely make a copy of the slides available. Do me a favor, Teresa. I'm going to add it to the top of this resource document as soon as we're off today. So I'll put a little placeholder so you guys know to look for it. And I'll add it as a link here. Catlin's presentation. Okay, so give me all of 3 minutes after we get off today, and I'll make sure I add that for you guys. Not a problem at all. Happy to do it. All right, so real-time feedback. Ooh, that's exciting. I love that strategy. It is a bit of a game changer in terms of workload as well. If you can get used to kind of pulling feedback into the classroom, some interest in hook the group. I love that one. I think especially for, I work with teachers sometimes where they're going to use the I do, we do, groups do, you do for their middle and lower level group, but for their high level group, they start with hook the group because those really strong students love academic challenge. Often they kind of thrive when it comes to oh, I don't know how to do this, instead of shutting down. So it can be an interesting way to pique student interest for our high achievers using hook the group, and then using a different strategy for our students who might be more in the middle or a little lower level in relation to a particular skill. Some interest in the assignment, check and review, present, pause, discuss. And I think for me, and this is on your resource document right underneath differentiated small group instruction, where it says 5 strategies for teacher-led station. It's not that one strategy is better than the other, but I think it's really, really helpful to have a collection of strategies that we can pull from when we're working with students. So thank you guys for ranking those. I just put into the chat window the today's course feedback form. And for anybody joining me today who might have been with me last week, just a heads up, I have a series of these. So if you're interested in data-driven design and how we use assessment to kind of better differentiate and personalize learning, if you're interested in metacognitive skill building and getting students really thinking about their learning and thinking about their progress, or engaging families, I've got a lot of webinars coming up. I would love for you to join me. Spread the word if you have other New York City teachers who might be interested in kind of joining. And then remember, I'm really easy to find and get in touch with online if you have questions after today. And I'm happy to stay on for a minute or two and field any questions that you have that didn't get answered in the chat window. And as soon as I close, I will go in and make my presentation a PDF and add it to that resource document for you guys. So thank you for spending the last hour with me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. And like I said, I will stay on to answer any questions that didn't get answered today.